Okay, so the big main player, I suppose, in this psychodynamic theory is Sigmund Freud, as we know. I had a picture of him on the previous slide, and Freud had a view about the human mind. He's got the psychodynamic theory has got lots and lots of different parts to it, but this is where we start about what's actually happening in the human mind. So this is what he thought the human mind looked like, and he's kind of suggested it was a little bit like an iceberg, and an iceberg is, as we know, a large chunk of ice that floats around in the water. The problem with it is that the vast majority of it is actually underneath the surface. So if you bumped into it, you might think, okay, I've just bumped into a small bit of ice, but actually it's a huge big chunk underneath there which has just wrecked your boat. So this is what he said. He said that the human mind, a bit like an iceberg, in that there is a conscious level, a subconscious level, and an unconscious level. And he said the conscious level was all those things that we are aware of in everyday life. So these are our thoughts and perceptions, things that we can bring to mind, we can declare out into to everybody, and we know about them, or we can we've got them there. So they are the conscious level thoughts. That's the bit which is above the surface. The subconscious level is that bit which is kind of in the ripples there of the water. It's the bit that's is just below the surface, bobs up and down below the surface, and then back up above the surface. So this is things like our memories. Now, our memories are not something we can declare all the time. We're not consciously aware of having memories, but we can bring them to mind should we choose to. We have to delve down into our recesses of our mind to do so. That's the same with stored knowledge as well. So I guess what the whole process of revision is bringing that stored knowledge from the subconscious level up to the conscious level, so that you can apply it in an exam situation. But anyway, that's the two parts of the mind according to Freud. So you have the conscious level and the subconscious level. The bit that is by far and away the most important bit to Freud, though, is that bit which is right underneath the water, which is the unconscious level. And these are all those bits that we are completely unaware of, really. We don't know where they come from. We might sense them occasionally, but actually they're hidden right underneath the surface. So these are all our fears and our violent motives and unacceptable sexual desires. I'll be saying that a lot during this slideshow. Immoral urges, the shame that we have about certain things, and all those selfish needs that are right at the heart. Now you can see straight away here, can't you, that actually this is not a particularly optimistic way of looking at people. It's saying that there is a whole layer underneath our conscious awareness that is all about very selfish and self-centered desires. Okay, so that's how Freud looked at the human mind. So just a little bit more information there. So conscious mind, merely tip of the iceberg, thoughts, perceptions, etc. I think we can skip through that. Same with the unconscious mind. Okay. Right, okay, this is quite important actually. So according to Freud, what happens with some of our memories in the unconscious mind is that they become repressed. Now, repression is a defense mechanism that we'll talk about a little bit later, but this is one of the ways in which we can push down memories that might be threats to us in some way, that might disturb us, might be unpleasant memories. We repress them, we place them in a different area, we can store them away, and they get stored, according to Freud, in the unconscious mind. That's the preconscious or preconscious and subconscious are pretty much the same thing, really. And Freud talked about the fact that we had this preconscious or subconscious, and that it manifested itself through things like our dreams. So Freud was a big one for the interpretation of dreams. There was a whole book written about it, wasn't there? And he said that those are manifestations of our preconscious mind, and to some degree our unconscious mind as well. The other thing is slips of the tongue, so what we call Freudian slips. So occasionally we will say things that are maybe contain a rude word, or they display what we're really thinking, and they are in our preconscious thoughts, so that they slip into the conscious mind through slips of the tongue. Okay, and that gives an indication, according to Freud, of the fact that we have this preconscious. Okay, what about the personality then? So we've got the kind of the basic ideas of the mind, but let's think about the personality. Now, when we're talking about personality, we're talking about things that are completely within our unconscious mind. You know, this hasn't really anything to do with the conscious mind or the pre-conscious. It's all to do with the unconscious. And according to Freud, personality is divided into three distinct parts that interact with each other, and he called that the tripartite structure of personality. And so he said there was three parts. Okay, so what's the first part called? It's called the id. Okay, so the id is the id is the part of the personality that we are born with and is the most primitive. So babies are born with an id, essentially. This is where all our unconscious basic drives come from. So food and water and sex, etc., all come from this area of the id. And Freud said it works on the pleasure principle. So in other words, our id is all about getting what we want as quick as possible, instant gratification of its needs. So I don't know, if you want to put some moral judgment on this, you could say it's a very selfish part of our personality. It's the bit that wants what it wants as quick as possible, you know. You know, we talked about the fact that babies are born with this. This is the first thing that we have. I mean, you think about a baby, it's not bothered about doing anything for anyone else, is it? It just wants to get what it wants. Okay, anything which is pleasurable, it will seek out. So the second part to form, according to Freud, is what's known as the ego. Okay, and this starts developing at around about the age of 2 years of age. All right. The ego is based on what Freud called the reality principle, and the reality principle is obviously different from the pleasure principle because it rationalizes the idea that we can't always get what we want all the time. Okay, but it also has a very important part to play, does the ego, using this reality principle, because it's going to play a huge part in reducing conflict with another part of the personality that's going to form quite soon, which is called the superego, and it does this by employing these things called defense mechanisms. We've already mentioned repression before, but there are two other defense mechanisms that we need to be aware of. So that's the job of the ego. It's kind of the referee in a bit of a fight between the id and the next part of the personality, which is called the superego. So this is the superego then. So the superego forms at around about 5 years of age. Now this is the first time we've started to see some of the psychosexual phases being used here, which we'll no doubt just talk about a little bit later. So the superego forms during the phallic stage, around about the time of the Oedipus complex. And according to Freud, this is our conscience. This is what we use to determine what is right and wrong. Now that's not to suggest that children under the age of 5 are amoral, okay, but their internal sense of right and wrong has not been fully developed. So the superego is based on the morality principle, and Freud said that we develop our moral standards through our same-sex parent. Now this is pretty controversial, isn't it, really? Because what it's saying essentially is if you're a boy, you develop those moral standards through your father. If you're a girl, you develop them through your mother. Well, what if you don't have a father at home, or what if you don't have a mother? There are plenty of families like that, aren't there? So there's some issues right from the very start. Superego has a big part to play in punishing the ego. So the ego has a terrible job, really, hasn't it? It's got to work out this little fight here that's going on between the id. The id wants, it wants what it wants. It wants things that are pleasurable to it, whereas the superego is all about determining what's right and wrong. So if the id wants something which is actually amoral, then the superego will say no, and it will punish the ego through feelings of guilt. So that's just a little idea there about what's happening, the interplay between these three parts of the unconscious personality. So the id might say, I want chocolate, and the superego says, no, you're on a diet, it's wrong. So it punishes the ego, says, here's some guilt for you, and the ego comes up with a solution. It says, right, okay, well, you can have chocolate, but it's only going to be a small bar. Compromise. Okay, so the idea of defense mechanisms then. So we've already said that the ego is responsible for defense mechanisms. It's how the defense mechanisms are how it actually works out the conflict between the id and the superego. But there are three that you need to know about on the AQA scheme. The first one we've already touched on, which is repression. And this is the idea of forcing a distressing memory out of the conscious mind. Okay, so to repress something, you're pushing it away, you're placing it somewhere else, you're not dealing with it, you know it's there, but you're pushing it away. Okay, so that's repression. Not to be confused with denial. Denial is when you simply refuse to acknowledge something. Okay, so different to repression. Repression, you know that it's happened, you're not denied it, you've just placed it somewhere else until you can deal with it another day. Denial is simply just saying, no, it's not happened. So that could be, for instance, someone's lost their job and continue to turn up to work every day. They're denying that it ever happens. Displacement. Displacement is a defense mechanism whereby you may be angry or distressed with a particular person or a particular situation, but what you do is that you instead of directing your feelings of distress onto that particular person, you direct them onto a substitute target. The reason for that might be that the reason for your distress is your parents, and it's socially unacceptable to be angry or distressed with your parents, and therefore you substitute that onto friends or colleagues or the dog, whoever it happens to be. So that's displacement. Okay, I'm just going to pop all these up here so we can see them all in one go. So psychosexual stages, another part of Freud's theory. So we've already talked about the personality types. We said there's id, ego, superego, they're in conflict with each other, etc. And we know that they are formed at different times. But Freud said that actually there was a distinct stage approach to how it is that we develop over, particularly over childhood. He did talk about over the lifespan, but the childhood is the most important bit. And he talks about 5 distinct psychosexual stages. And what he said was at each stage there is a particular conflict that we need to overcome. The only one that's different to that is the latency stage. Okay. And what he said was that the inability to overcome these conflicts is the source, or can be the sources, of issues in later life. Because what's happened is that we have had a fixation. We've become fixed at that particular point. We've been unable to overcome that conflict. We have a fixation, and we carry that through our life. And it manifests itself in lots of different ways, depending on the type of fixation it is. Okay, so what I'm going to briefly do now is to go through these with you. We're going to look at the oral stage to start off with. So oral stage is the birth to 18 months stage. Now remember, what's this associated with? Well, we only have an id, don't we, at this point? The ego hasn't even formed. So the child is focused on oral pleasures, so anything to do with the mouth. Okay, so you'll see children will pick things up and put things into their mouth at this stage. They like to suck things. Okay, oral pleasures. So too much or too little gratification at this point can result in an oral fixation, or what's known as an oral personality. So according to Freud, if you were unable to overcome the conflicts at this particular stage, okay, so if you get too much oral pleasure or too little, then what will happen is that you will have a fixation in later life, and that could manifest itself in things like smoking, drinking alcohol, overeating, biting your nails for some bizarre reason, anything which is to do with placing things in your mouth, I guess is what he's talking about. Also, people with an oral fixation may become overly dependent upon others, potentially gullible followers, could become pessimistic and aggressive as well. So there's all manner of different sort of problems associated with a fixation at this stage. Okay, so now we have the idea of the next stage, which is the 18 months to 3 years stage, and that's called the anal stage. And the idea of this one is, again, this is the one that all students always think to themselves, how absolutely bizarre. But what Freud said was that the center of focus moves away from the mouth and goes on to the anus, and it's the idea of eliminating and retaining feces, according to Freud, is what actually brings pleasure to the child. Okay. Now, again, we have a situation where we can get a fixation at this stage. There's a conflict here which can occur, and one of the reasons that can occur, or the main reason, is because there is massive societal pressure, I guess, on children learning to control what's happening in terms of producing feces. You know, potty training is associated with this particular area, isn't it? So if children are made to feel guilty, if children are chastised in too big a way, they can get what's known as an anal fixation. And an anal fixation, if that was the case, would be someone who would be obsessed with cleanliness, perfection, control, etc. We call that sort of person anally retentive, and that's a phrase that's used quite regularly to describe people who are overly pernickety about organising things in particular, obsessed with cleaning. The opposite of that is when you have someone who perhaps hasn't had a particularly satisfying, I guess could be the word, potty training experience, i.e. they've just been allowed to do what they wanted to do. They haven't been trained in the old art of the potty, shall we say. And they've, as a result of that, they have a fixation, and that fixation manifests itself as someone in later life who is very, very messy, very disorganized, what we call anally expulsive. So if you're a messy person, maybe you want to ask your parents about potty training, what happens. Okay, so now we're moving into, I think, probably the most important of the areas, really, because this has a massive impact on later life, and it's called the phallic stage. Now, you'll instantly see here that the phallic stage, you notice a massive tendency to use male terms here, you know. So Freud has often been accused of being quite male-centered. I suppose androcentric would be the word we describe in his approach. Anyway, what's happening here? This is 3 to 5 years of age. So you've got the ego is well formed now, and at the end of this phase, we're going to get the formation of the superego. Pleasure zone has moved from the anus now to the genitals. And what Freud said was that this stage is indicated by two types of conflict, depending on whether you're male or female. For a male, it's what's known as the Oedipus complex, and the Oedipus complex is unconscious sexual desires for your mother. Okay. What happens then, of course, is that you are thrust into this situation where you are in conflict with your father. You become a rival for your mother's affection. And you have to find, according to Freud, some way of being able to deal with that, because you're worried as a boy that you're going to be found out. And you fear that if that is the case, that because obviously your pleasure zone is switched to your genitals, that you're going to be castrated by your father. So how do you deal with that? Well, you learn to identify with your father. It comes from this Oedipus complex, this Greek mythology. Accidentally killed his father and married his mother. Yeah, so just to reiterate there, so out of fear of castration, boys eventually decide to identify with him rather than fight him. Okay, so if you think about what we talked about at the start there about moral development, that's important, isn't it? Because the male has now identified with the other male in his life, his father, and that's why moral development can occur. So it all links together, doesn't it? Okay, so what they say is that if this Oedipus complex is not overcome effectively, then a fixation will occur. We become Oedipus complex fixated. And according to Freud, that will result in what he calls sexual deviance and confused sexual identity. Very, very controversial. I think you'd agree that what he's basically saying is that homosexuality could be caused by an Oedipus complex fixation. That's quite a claim, isn't it? But that's the idea that we have within this particular approach. So from the female point of view, it's not quite as brutal for the girls as it is for the boys. So the same sort of thing is occurring, an unconscious sexual attraction to their father this time, and that's termed not the Oedipus complex this time, it's called the Electra complex. And according to Freud, girls develop penis envy. Okay, they are envious of the fact that their father has a penis. And what eventually happens if the conflict is to be overcome is that this feeling, this penis envy, this complex is replaced for a desire for a baby, identification with the mother. So again, you see how that's linked back to the mother moral development of the same sex individual. Okay, latency stage, really easy. According to Freud, this is where everything gets repressed. This is a good time to be a child, you know. There is no problem. They play mostly with the same-sex peers, but they interact and play, and there's no kind of psychosexual stages really going on. This is the stage of kind of rest almost before the next big stage, which is in puberty, isn't it? Okay, and this is where everyone finds themselves eventually, according to Freud, in the genital stage. So again, at the time of puberty, sexual urges are reawakened, and the seat of pleasure becomes based upon the genitals again. Okay, so we become attracted obviously to opposite sex peers, and I mentioned that pleasure is the genitals. So that's where people are through the rest of their lives. Unresolved conflicts. It's a strange one, this one, really, because you would have an unresolved conflict right through your entire life here, wouldn't you? So again, Freud equates that back to issues with forming heterosexual relationships. So he's making some very bold claims here, isn't he? Right, what's he based all this on? Now, I'm not going to go through the whole case of Little Hands, but if you want to go back into your book or to your notes and just have a little look at the case study of Little Hands, that looks specifically at the Oedipus complex and Freud's interpretation of that particular study. You can see it's a very old study. It's well over 100 years of age, 100 years old now, but that's something for you to have a little look at. Okay, so in terms of interpretation and evaluation of what Freud has left us, well, first of all, obviously we can use Little Hands as a piece of supporting material, but how can we use it? It's probably not the strongest piece of evidence, is it? One thing we can say about psychodynamic theory is that it's highly influential. Whilst it might appear very, very strange to us with our 21st century eyes, I guess, you know, it has had a massive impact on psychology, dominant force in the early years of the 20th century, and was the first kind of theory, I suppose, that sort of linked those ideas of what happened in someone's childhood to what happened to them in future life, and about what might be the evolution, or the origins, I should say, of poor behaviour or mental illness or moral development, or poor moral development, whatever happens to be. So it's been highly influential. For instance, in the work of John Bowlby, attachment theory is at its heart a psychodynamic theory, innate drives, etc. So if you think about how influential attachment theory has been, then a lot of it can be brought back to the world of psychodynamic theory. Not surprising, there are some big limitations with the work of Freud here. One of the big problems is, of course, again, you have an ideographic approach. Case studies and very, very small numbers of people really have been used in order to formulate all of these theories, and you can't generalize those out to the wider population. Also, as well, apart from the lack of scientific rigor there with the particular methodologies, the interpretations of the results of those. I mean, think about little hands for a moment. I mean, would anyone else in the world have come up with that interpretation for a phobia of horses? Probably unlikely. I mean, the behaviourists could come up with all sorts of things, couldn't they, would make an awful lot more sense. So again, you could compare it to theories that are better in some ways, and the interpretations are highly subjective and probably only likely to have ever been made by Freud. Because you've got a ideographic approach, because you've got an approach that talks about the unconscious mind, well, no one's ever found the unconscious mind, and therefore the psychodynamic theory is absolutely full of untestable hypotheses. You just can't make hypotheses that can be tested here because you can't find what it is you're looking for. It's a bad theory in a way, because it's in terms of science in general, because it's non-falsifiable. As a psychodynamicist, you could make any claim for the id, ego and superego and repression and displacement and all the rest of it by saying that they're there in the unconscious mind, but you can't see them, they're hidden. Therefore they can't be tested, and therefore it's non-falsifiable. And it's been described as a pseudoscience. Doesn't it? It looks like a science. It has all the kind of appearances of being scientific, but actually it lacks the rigor of a real scientific theory, and therefore, like I say, it's known as a pseudoscience. More limitations. What a surprise. It's brought about psychoanalysis, which is good. That's a good thing. You could call that a strength, so it does have real world applications. The only problem is with psychoanalysis that it's only really ever been seen to be successful with people with maybe mild neuroses. So people suffering from severe mental illnesses, don't do psychoanalysis with them. It's totally inappropriate, particularly because people in that situation just don't have the insight in order to actually be able to work out what's going on with them. The other thing with psychoanalysis is that it takes years and years and years, significant time commitment. Most of the other talking therapies are about personal agency. They want the person to kind of work it out by themselves, if you will. Psychoanalysis takes quite the opposite approach, really. This might sound a bit controversial, but would like the client to become a little bit more dependent on the psychoanalyst, and that's a massive issue, really. So it's a limited applicability, and maybe some ethical issues there perhaps as well. Okay, so there's issues with determinism here as well. So psychic determinism in this particular case, that's the type, is highly deterministic. According to Freud, nothing happens by accident, which is about the most deterministic thing you can say, isn't it, really? So whilst there appears to be free will in the world, again, according to Freud, it's an illusion. It's everything is determined for you by these basic forces that are going on inside you, and these conflicts that are beyond your conscious minds. So highly deterministic, and the type here is psychic determinism.